Okay. Thank you, Fumiaki, for the kind introduction. I'm very happy to be here. As you know, I'm retired and I'm still doing some research with a very slow pace, also because I'm lazy. So that's why I'm thankful to Fumiaki and Oliver and the organizers because I've been forced to do some work, which otherwise maybe would have taken a lot of time. So basically, I revisited an old paper I presented at some FOMI workshop, I guess, together with Giancarlo and Daniele Porello, which has been radically revised now. I see ontological analysis as a search for truth makers. So basically, they help in deciding what to put in our ontology. So the answer to the question is, let's put there the entities that are responsible for the truth of our propositions. And so it is like having a kind of detective lens in using sometimes hard formal ontological analysis for coming up to deciding what these so-called truth makers are. So basically, this means asking what makes our statements about the world true, or in other words, the world is what we have in mind. What do we believe the world is when you say, for instance, that John is married with Mary? Okay, already Gwendalina showed us that the notion of marriage may evolve, and the point is what really being married means. What is the word we have in mind when we say the rose is red, the redness stuff and so on? What it means that my name is Nicola? What is the truth maker of the fact that my name is Nicola? Well, something which happened many years ago, okay, when my parents decided to ascribe this name to me. These are all examples of truth makers. And I see ontological analysis about making these truth makers explicit. In the domain of information systems or conceptual modeling, this means reifying certain entities by putting them in the domain of discourse. So the domain of discourse is, let's say, an engineering version of ontology. It is interesting concerning the vision of truth making as a search for ontological analysis as a search for truth maker. It is interesting this quotation from Armstrong, who says, talking of the role of Quine in ontology, he says the great advantage of the search for truth makers is that it focuses not merely on the metaphysical implications of the subject terms of propositions, but also on their predicates. Quine has told us that the predicate gives us the ideology rather than ontology, but this saying is rather dark, but it's clear to some degree that Quine has stacked the ontological deck against predicates as opposed to subject terms. But when we look to truth makers, for truths, subject and predicate start as equals, and we can consider the implications of both in an unbiased way. So there is a role of predicates besides the role of subjects of a proposition. So there are, as we shall see, there are two kinds of truth makers. There are the mainstream view is about the so-called strong truth makers. So according to this view, the truth maker of a proposition is a suitable entity in virtue of which this proposition holds. The problem is understanding the meaning of in virtue of. The standard answer, in virtue of means in virtue of the existence of something. This is the standard answer. So the propositions that A is a rose holds in virtue of the existence of a certain rose, the existence of A. If A is red, this proposition holds in virtue, and this is a bit harder, in virtue maybe of the existence of a certain redness trope or redness event. To me, tropes are, at the end of the day, events. By the way, these two examples show concern the two different kinds of properties. I say that red is a descriptive property, and being red is a predescriptive property, and being a rose is a non-descriptive property. I will say something more about these distinctions later. Anyway, strong truth makers are such that their mere existence entails the proposition's truth. There are several assumptions behind the mainstream version of truth making, and there are also problems. The standard assumptions is so-called truth maker necessitarianism, okay, which George Parsons, an equivalent term is essentialism. Basically, it is in terms of the essence of the things that certain propositions are. Okay. So if T is truth maker of phi at a certain word, then it is a truth maker of phi in every word. This is the main assumption, which is hidden, which is part of the standard assumption. Related to this, there is another assumption, which is the so-called truth maker maximalism, which says that every true sentence must have a truth maker, okay? And this starts a number of problems, especially when we deal with complex propositions involving negation, disjunctions, and so on and so forth. A lot of problems. The philosophers are still debating about this. George Parsons, which is making a different proposal about truth making, has a more modest position. He says the best we can demand is that every contingent truth either has a truth maker or is a conjunction, disjunction, negation, or some other more complicated Boolean functional propositions that would have truth makers where they are true. Basically, he excludes the idea that every arbitrary complex proposition necessarily has to have a truth maker. So basically, we are especially from the application point of view, we are interested in truth makers or simple propositions, so-called atomic propositions, those propositions which do not involve logical quantifiers or connectives. So, strong truth making is related to so for strong truth making, the proposition holds, as we have seen, in virtue of the mere existence of something. This means it holds in virtue of whether something exists or not. Whether something exists. If this exists, then the proposition is true. So-called the weak truth maker, we have called it, Giancarlo and I have called it weak truth making. This is a proposal by, non-orthodox proposal by George Parsons, holds in virtue of the way something is, in virtue of how something is. Consider the standard example of the red rose. Okay, consider a rose which is red at time t1, and suppose that the same rose becomes brown at time t2. According to the mainstream view, these two propositions require each a different strong truth maker. A particular redness at a certain time and a different redness at another time. And these two rednesses are two different things, okay? Two different strong truth makers. George Parsons says that there is it is just the rose itself which is the truth maker, because the proposition holds in virtue of the way the rose is at time t1 and in virtue of the way the rose is at time t2. These are basically George Parsons introduced this notion in two different papers at a certain distance in time. The first paper was in 1999, and the second paper was in 2005. Parsons' criterion for a weak truth maker is the following, the main intuitive criterion. He introduces two criteria. The first, the most intuitive one is the following. For every true sentence, there is something such that the sentence cannot be falsified without a qualitative change in that thing. Okay, so the rose is red. You cannot falsify this proposition unless something changes in the rose itself, namely its color. The color changes. The rose itself is the same. The color changes, so the proposition that the rose is red is falsified. So the thing which is, so to speak, responsible of the way the rose is the weak truth maker. It is the color which is responsible for the fact that the rose is red. Here is our rose, okay? We say it is red, okay? The rose itself is such that the proposition, the rose is red, is true, okay? The rose itself is responsible because of the way it is, okay? Now, the rose is red, it is responsible for the proposition. Tomorrow, the rose will be brown. The same rose which will be still responsible of the truth of the proposition, okay? So the rose itself is a weak truth maker. Then we can ask whether it is minimal. What is the minimal weak truth maker of the proposition the rose is red? Okay? What is at the bottom responsible for this fact? Well, first of all, it is the corolla, not the whole rose. Okay, this is a convention. Okay, so it is the corolla because of the way it is, which is responsible of the fact that it is red. More exactly, the color of the corolla, okay, and we are reifying this notion of color of the corolla. The color of the corolla is responsible for the fact that the rose is red. The color of the corolla is the minimal weak truth maker. The rose is red cannot become false without a change in a particular quality, which is the color of the corolla of the rose. And here I'm relying on the notion of individual qualities, which is well accepted it was introduced first in the Dolce ontology, now it is there in the Buffo ontology and in the UFO ontology, the notion of individual quality. I will say just a few things about individual qualities just to make sure we are on the same line. Individual qualities are, let's say, reified aspects of things. Okay, there is a rose, there is a sofa. These are qualities, are aspects of things that we use to compare them. Okay, the rose, we can compare the rose and the sofa, which maybe are uncomparable, but they share the same color. So first we select a particular aspect of the rose, a particular aspect of the sofa, and then we say, well, according to this aspect, they are similar. okay? So they are aspects of things we used to compare them. And these individual qualities inhere in specific individuals. This means that they are existentially dependent on the thing they inhere in. And the qualities are distinct from their values, so-called qualia, which are abstract entities, maybe resembling what exactly expressing what exactly resembling individual qualities have in common. Okay? And these qualia are organized in a quality space. I will not go into the details. At different times, the individual quality keeps its identity, moving in the quality space. So the color of the rose at time t1 is the same entity as the color of the rose at time t2, although it changes, it is an intrinsic change, it changes in the quality space. And we say that individual qualities are not to be confused with properties. Properties hold, qualities exist. So these are things I put in my domain of discourse. And it may be interesting to compare qualities with tropes, okay? Katharina mentioned tropes already, okay? No commitment to tropes is necessary to admit these individual qualities, since there is indeed good evidence, especially in the light of this truth-making analysis, that these qualities deserve their own ontological status. And I like to mention this quote from Pryor, pretty old: the respects in which objects are to be characterized, okay, so the aspects of objects to which determinable adjectives refer are related to the objects not less but more intimately than the determinate qualities which characterize them in the strictly proper sense of the term. So the determinate qualities are the tropes, okay? There are tropes and there are qualities. You can have both, but qualities are more important. And what is the explanatory power of qualities as weak truth makers? Compare: the rose is red because of its redness. Okay? If you take tropes as truth makers, this is the strong view, okay? The redness is a trope whose existence makes true the fact that the rose is red. Fine. On the other hand, if you take weak truth making, the rose is red because of its color. I believe that the second sentence is more informative. Okay? The first sentence is a bit trivial in a sense. The rose is red because of its redness. Because in the second case, the sentence picks up a particular aspect of the rose, namely the color, and not the weight, for instance, which is responsible for the truth of the sentence. So in a sense, it contributes to explaining the nature of the red predication. Okay? There is a predicate, the predicate holds because of a particular entity, because of the way a particular entity is. This is just a picture of how we see individual qualities. I will be quick. Okay, there is an apple in this case. There is the apple's color, which inheres in the apple, is an instance of the color, of the class of color qualities, and has a value. Color qualities are associated to a particular space. In this case, it's a complex space for colors. So a value of a quality is a point in this quality space. For weight, the space is linear, and so on. So this is enough for qualities, for the role of individual qualities as weak truth makers. But also parts can be weak truth makers. This is Socrates. This is an example by George Parsons, by the way. And we can ask ourselves, okay, the proposition is Socrates is snub-nosed. What is the minimal weak truth maker for this proposition? Of course, the nose. the nose, which is a part of Socrates. Okay? It is because of the way the nose is that we say that Socrates is snub-nosed. Okay? More exactly, the shape of the nose is responsible for the proposition Socrates is snub-nosed. So in a sense, the nose and the shape somehow ground the statement, which cannot become false unless the nose changes, the shape, more exactly the shape of the nose changes. I put ground in red. This makes starts a question which I will go back in at the end, the difference between truth-making and grounding. Okay? There are different things. Grounding is more about explanation. Truth-making is about existence. Weak truth-making, in a sense, is in the middle. Okay, let's now try to formalize the initial intuitive criterion George Parsons proposed about weak truth-making. He suggests a second criterion, which for him is the central one. And he says that the truth maker for a sentence is that thing that is intrinsically such that the sentence is true. Okay? For him, this criterion 2 and criterion 1 are equivalent. Okay, criterion 1 was if something, the proposition is true, it can be falsified if only if there is a qualitative change in the truth maker. Okay, this was criterion 1. This definition is complicated because we have to understand what it means to be intrinsically such that. In his earlier paper, Parsons adopts Lewis' definition of intrinsicality based on duplication. A property holds intrinsically for a certain entity if all possible duplicates of this entity have the same property. Okay? A property is intrinsic if it is shared by all duplicates. This has several problems. First of all, proliferation of irrelevant truth makers, okay, because I have a rows 1 and then a duplicate, which is rows 2. Also, the duplicate, because of the way duplicates are constructed, the duplicate rows 2 is also responsible for the fact that rows 1 is red. Okay. So this means that all duplicates do the same role concerning truth making, which is a bit anti-intuitive and runs against the first criterion Parsons introduced. Another problem he mentioned is that so-called atheistic properties like being Nicola, okay, are considered to be intrinsic. Being Nicola is intrinsic to me, but it is not shared among all my duplicates, okay, because every duplicate has its own name. So Parsons is happy with problem 1. For him, it is okay, because indeed he says the weak truth maker is related to the nature something is, and this nature is exactly what the notion of duplication captures. All the duplicates have the same nature. So he's happy with problem 1, but he's not happy with problem 2. So basically, at the end of the day, he abandons duplication-based intrinsicality and relies on another school of thought concerning intrinsicality, which is based on the so-called combinatorial approach, based on the so-called independence platitude. Basically, the story is that to be intrinsically F is to be F independently of the intrinsic nature of one's surroundings, the accompaniment and loneliness. If you make something true independently of what is around, okay, you are making something true intrinsically, okay, because you don't need anything else besides yourself to contribute to truth of the proposition. And still, philosophers are discussing even this second approach about intrinsicality based on duplication. Okay, although the idea of loneliness and accompaniment is indeed interesting, for the practical purposes, since at the end of the day we want to use these ideas for applied ontology, for practical purposes, it's enough for us to concentrate on the property of being such that phi, where phi is an atomic proposition. Okay, so we get rid of all the problems concerning the complex nature of these properties. And I say that the property of being such that phi, where phi is an atomic proposition, holds intrinsically for X if it holds independently of the presence or absence of any contingent object wholly distinct from X. So far, this is Lewis and his Langton, I guess. Okay? I had a proviso concerning the notion of wholly distinct. Okay, wholly distinct for X. If X is wholly distinct from Y, it means that not only X and Y do not overlap, okay, but also that there is no indirect or indirect existential relationship between them. In order to understand the way I'm defining this, we have to consider examples. By the way, first of all, make sure we understand what it means to be such that phi. Okay, this is a kind of strange property. Okay, so-called vacuous property, because it is not very much informative. Basically, X is such that phi, X exists, and phi holds. That's it. Okay, but this being such that phi may hold intrinsically for certain objects and extrinsically for others. Okay, if Rosie 1 and Rosie 2 are both red, okay, being such that Rosie 1 is red, of course, it holds intrinsically for Rosie 1, but Rosie 2 is not intrinsically such Rosie 1 is red, okay, because for the Rosie 1 to be red, it requires the existence of Rosie 1, and Rosie 1 is wholly distinct from Rosie 2. So if we take this definition, the problem of truthmakers proliferation disappears, okay? Because Rosie 2 cannot be the truthmakers because the proposition requires something else, namely Rosie 1, which is disjoint from Rosie 2. I hope it's clear. Let's explore the consequence of this, okay? Still focusing on descriptive properties and relations. So descriptive properties, to me, are those that hold in virtue of how their arguments are, as opposite to what their arguments are. And for instance, being a person is not descriptive, okay? Being red is descriptive. Being happy is descriptive. And I will present now several examples. Time check. Okay. Several examples concerning first the properties and their truth makers. Properties may be relational or non-relational. And then relations and their truth makers. And relations may be internal or external, and we shall see. By the way, I'm talking of properties and their truth makers. More exactly, the truth makers are truth bearer are propositions, not properties. Okay, but for this, it is easy to talk of truth makers of the correspondent of the propositions that are correspondent to certain relations. Okay, so Okay, let's go again to our example. First, the simple one, rose is red. Okay, we've seen that rose's color is the minimal we should make. Why? Okay, let's apply our definition. It is minimal. We have means it is a truthmaker means that it makes the proposition truth without requiring the existence of anything disjoint from it. Okay. Now we can say the color of the rose is such that the rose is red, okay? Suppose that the color is actually red. Then it makes true the proposition that the rose is red. But this requires the existence of rosy, okay? But the rosy is not distinct from its quality because the quality is existentially dependent on the rose. Okay, so it's okay. It's okay. The color can be the truth makers. This is the reason of the proviso on existential dependence. Okay, because in order to make something true, I need to be able to do this without the accompaniment of anything. Okay, I am the color of the rose. I make true that the rose is red. This requires the existence of the rose, yes, but this guy is not wholly disjoint from me, okay? So the definition works. Note, however, that if I accept, if rose is red, depends on the existence of rosy, fine, okay? But if the rosy exists, okay, of course it has a color, but maybe necessarily it has also some other qualities like the mass, okay? For we say, okay, the color alone is enough for making true that rose is red. Well, it is not alone because there is also the mass. But the mass is existentially dependent of the rose. So again, the proviso I proposed is enough to exclude any problems. So ultimately, yes, the color is the weak truth maker of the proposition. Consider now non-relational properties. Another example of a non-relational property being snub-nosed again, okay? Let's check if really, according to the definition, so the formal definition, Socrates' nose is indeed a truth maker, okay? So the nose makes true the proposition holds, okay? The proposition requires the existence of Socrates, okay, which is a different thing. Okay, there is the nose, there is Socrates, but Socrates overlaps its nose. Okay, so there is no problem. So the things go without the necessity of assuming the existence of anything else. Okay, there is the nose, there is Socrates. Socrates overlaps the nose. Fine. But not necessarily so. So we say, okay, Socrates exists, but Socrates depends necessarily on his brain, okay? So there is the nose, there is Socrates, but there is also the brain, which is a problem, creates problems because it is distinct, wholly distinct from, seems to be wholly distinct from the nose. That's why I introduced the notion of indirectly existential dependence, okay? Something is indirectly existential dependent on something else if it is a proper part of something that is existentially dependent on Y. So the nose is a proper part of Socrates, which is existentially dependent on his brain, okay? So again, the problem is solved and the definition works. So ultimately we say that the nose is a weak truth maker of the proposition that Socrates is not nosed. As we have seen, it is not the minimal weak truth maker because there is the shape of the nose. But anyway, we see that the proviso we have introduced in the definition originally proposed by Lewis and Langton works. Now, things have become more interesting when we go to relational properties. John loves, when we go to relations, okay, first relational properties and then relations, genuine relations. John loves Mary. I should have said John is loving Mary. This is more exactly, okay, it is a property of John. By the way, unfortunately, not necessarily reciprocated. Okay, John is in love with Mary. That's it. He's loving Mary. He's married. In this case, differently from the previous cases, the subject of the sentence, which is John, is not a truth maker. Previously, when you say the rose is red, the rose, which is the subject of the sentence, is a truth maker. Now, the subject of the sentence is not the weak truth maker, because he alone is not enough to make the sentence true. Mary has to exist, okay? And Mary is disjoint from John. However, there is a weak truth maker, which is John's emotional attitude towards Mary, okay? Which is, again, is reified. It is an aspect of John, okay? In the UFO ontology, this is called a relational mode, okay? UFO generalizes the notion of individual qualities. There are colors and there are modes like love, commitment, and so on and so on. Okay, these are things that inhere in substances in the same way qualities inhere in substances. So modes are generalizations of individual qualities, and in this example, the mode, this emotional attitude towards Mary is enough to be the truth maker. This is just a clarification of the role of modes in UFO ontology. Okay, there are qualities. Ultimately, qualities are aspects of things. Okay, remember the citation of Prior before. Okay, and there are monadic aspects and more complicated, very logical sums of aspects. I will go to them soon. Okay. Within the monadic aspects, we distinguish qualities and modes. Okay? Qualities have a quality space associated. Modes do not have a quality space associated. For instance, the love for somebody is a mode. Now let's go to the relations. Time?
17 minutes.
Okay. Let's go to the relations. Taller than. Taller than is an example of so-called internal relations. According to Russell, internal relations are those which are definable in terms of the intrinsic properties of their relata. Okay? Taller than, the two relata are two objects, two persons, for instance. Okay? The relation holds in virtue of the heights of the two persons. Indeed, comparative relations are the typical example of internal relations. By the way, the word, the naming of this classification is complicated because some philosophers use internal in a different sense. Okay, but Russell uses internal in this sense. So now, suppose that John is taller than Mary. John's height is not intrinsically such that the proposition holds, because the proposition also requires the existence of Mary and of Mary's height and so on. Okay, and Mary is wholly distinct from John's height. Okay, so what is the truth maker? Okay, John is not a truth maker. Okay, John's height is not a truth maker. Mary's height is not a truth maker. What is the truth maker? The truth maker is the mereological sum of the two heights. Okay, this mereological sum is existentially dependent on both John and Mary and does not require anything else for making the proposition true. And here is a picture, okay? Here is John, here is Mary, okay? And if I want to talk of the love between John and Mary, if I'm now going to the relation, not the property, not the relational property, but the relation between John and Mary, the fact that John and Mary are in love means, if I talk of want to talk of their love, I need to talk of John's love for Mary and Mary's love for John. Okay, I take the sum of the two, okay, the two modes, and this is the truth maker. And Giancarlo and I say this is the relationship. When I'm talking of the love between John and Mary is problematic now, okay? The relationship is problematic. I'm talking of these two things, okay? Two relational modes. And similarly for the heights, okay? In this case, we have the mereological sum of two qualities. In the first case, there is a mereological sum of two modes. So each of these relations hold in virtue of a sum of qualities or sum of modes inhering in the relata, okay? These sums are called relators in UFO, okay? Relators are sums of modes in general. And this is also a key construct in OntoUML. And now let's take, I'm going towards the conclusion, let's take another relation, a more interesting relation. We've been already talking about that, Gwendoline talked about that. Married with. John is married with Mary, okay? Now, this is an external relation. This is not internal because it is not definable in terms of the intrinsic properties of the relata. Okay, there is some genuinely relational in this case. Okay, and what are the properties of this relata? The necessary properties of the relata in order for the relation to hold. Let's say mutual commitments, obligations, and so on. Okay, of course, love, number of things. Okay, number of different modes which need to occur in the relata in order for the relation to hold. Okay, caring the children, helping each other, and so on and so forth. Okay, all these correspond to relational modes inhering in the relata. But the point is that the marriage relationship typically presupposes a number of these commitments. It is not just a simple things like being in love, which is already complicated, but being married involves much more, okay? Rights, obligations, and so on and so forth. So no single mereological sum of these two modes itself is enough for being a weak truth maker. In this case, the interesting thing is that the truth maker is the maximal mereological sum of all these modes which are required for the proposition to hold. Okay? The maximal thing, whatever is relevant for the marriage, needs to be part of the truth maker. And again, these mereological sums are called relators. In practice, just a couple of slides before ending. This idea of making truth makers explicit from the methodological point of view has been advertised by Giancarlo and myself as a methodology of unpacking simple models into more complicated models, making the truth makers explicit. Okay, so suppose I have suppose that I know that I have the color, but color is just an attribute for me. It is not that does not belong to the domain of discourse. If I unpack this model, I go to a more complicated model where the truth maker is made explicit, it appears explicit. There is a color quality which inheres in the rows. And maybe it is also important not to forget about the role of strong truth makers. Both strong and weak truth makers may require to be made explicit if we really want to account for the whole picture. So this generates so-called truth-making patterns. Okay, the first pattern is making the weak truth maker explicit. The second pattern is making the strong truth maker explicit, which in this case is an event, is the occurrence, or this is the state of being in that, for the rose in being in that, having that color. Okay, and I can put two things together. Okay, this is another truth-making pattern where all the truth makers, both the weak and the strong truth makers, are made explicit. Okay, there is a quality and there is a color occurrence, which is an event, and according to another paper we wrote about events, events are qualitative changes. Okay, and the color is the qualitative change, the qualitative, the quality which is responsible of the color occurrence of the event, is the focus of this event, but this is another story. Okay, so we see that we are ultimately, it may be useful for explanation purposes to make together weak truth makers and strong truth makers. This is an example just to show you the feeling of how things may become complicated. If you want to model a contractual relationship, then you can start making explicit the claims, the commitments on both kinds, and so on. There is the customer, there is the provider, there is the contract which evolves, which is an event, and so on and so forth. We have the right tools for going to this level of complication. Conclusions? In the title, the title was Truth-Making and Explanation. Is this explanation? Maybe not enough. Maybe not necessarily so, okay? Because truth-making is different from grounding. Grounding is indeed about explanation. For instance, why, maybe I have a slide. Okay. Indeed, in some cases, weak truth makers are trivial. The glass is fragile because of its fragility. And fragility can be modeled as a quality. Okay, but this is trivial. Okay? Maybe the glass is fragile because of its internal molecular structure. Okay, but this is grounding. It is not truth-making anymore. Okay? So in some cases, weak truth makers are trivial. In other cases, really mean something, revealing the internal structure of a relationship. Indeed, we can say that marriage actually means mutual commitments of a certain kind. So it means certain things. So I believe the conclusion is to me, we truth makers appear to have more explanatory power than strong truth makers. But this requires committing on individual qualities, modes, and so on. That's it.